So I made 25. So I'm really excited that I ran out. All right? Were they not awesome? And so you heard one version. Let me take this off. You heard one way to tell the story of this week. And now we shift to how Luke recounts the story of this week, or a portion of it. Listen now for the living word of God. And I remind you, you have parts in this as well. After Jesus had been arrested, questioned for the first time of several times that night, was mocked and beaten, and Peter had denied him 3 times, as Jesus had warned he would. Then the assembly rose as a body and brought Jesus before Pilate. They began to accuse him, saying, "We found this man perverting our nation, forbidding us to pay taxes to the emperor, and saying that he himself is the Messiah, a king." Then Pilate asked him, "Are you the king of the Jews?" He answered, "You say so." Then Pilate said to the chief priests and the crowds, "I find no basis for an accusation against this man." But they were insistent and said,
"He stirs up the people by teaching throughout all Judea, Galilee, where he began, even to this place." Jesus before Herod. When Pilate heard this, he asked whether the man was a Galilean. And when he learned that he was under Herod's jurisdiction, he sent him off to Herod, who was himself in Jerusalem at that time. When Herod saw Jesus, he was very glad, for he had been wanting to see him for a long time, because he had heard about him and was hoping to see him perform some sign. He questioned him at some length, but Jesus gave him no answer. The chief priests and the scribes stood by, vehemently accusing him. Even Herod with his soldiers treated him with contempt and mocked him. Then he put an elegant robe on him and sent him back to Pilate. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before, they had been enemies.
Jesus sentenced to death. Pilate then called together the chief priests, the leaders, and the people. And he said to them, "You brought me this man as one who was perverting people, and here I have examined him in your presence, and have not found this man guilty of any of your charges against him. Neither has Herod, for he sent him back to us. Indeed, he has done nothing to deserve death. I will therefore have him flogged and release him." Then they all shouted out together,
"Away with this fellow! Release Barabbas for us."
This was a man who had been put in prison for an insurrection that had taken place in the city and for murder. Pilate, wanting to release Jesus, addressed them again, but they kept shouting,
"Crucify him! Crucify him!"
A third time he said to them, "Why? What evil has he done? I have found in him no ground for the sentence of death. I will therefore have him flogged and then release him." But they kept urgently demanding with loud shouts that he should be crucified, and their voices prevailed. So Pilate gave his verdict that their demand should be granted. He released the man they asked for, and the one who had been put in prison for insurrection and murder. And he handed Jesus over as they wished.
The crucifixion of Jesus. As they led him away, they seized a man, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, and they laid the cross on him, made him carry it behind Jesus. A great number of the people followed him, and among them were women who were beating their breasts and wailing for him. But Jesus turned to them and said, "Daughters of Jerusalem, do not weep for me, but weep for yourselves and for your children. For the days are surely coming when they will say, 'Blessed are the barren, and the wombs that never bore, and the breasts that never nursed.' Then they will begin to say to the mountains, 'Fall on us,' and to the hills, 'Cover us.' For if they do this, when the wood is green, what will happen when it is dry?" 2 others also who were criminals were led away to be put to death with him. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, they crucified Jesus there with the criminals, one on his right and one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." And they cast lots to divide his clothing, and the people stood by watching. But the leaders scoffed at him, saying,
He saved others. Let him save himself if he is the Messiah of God, his chosen one.
The soldiers also mocked him, coming up and offering him sour wine, and saying,
If you are the king of the Jews, save yourself.
There was also an inscription over him, "This is the King of the Jews."
One of the criminals who were hanged there kept deriding him and saying, Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself. But the other rebuked him, saying, Do you not fear God, since you are under the same sentence of condemnation? And we indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds. But this man has done nothing wrong. Then he said,
Jesus, remember me when you come to your kingdom.
He replied, Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise.
The death of Jesus. It was now about noon. Darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed, and the curtain of the temples was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, Father, into your hands I commend my spirit. Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said,
Certainly this man was innocent.
And when all the crowds who had gathered there for this spectacle saw what had taken place, they returned home, beating their breasts. But all his acquaintances, including the women who had followed him from Galilee, stood at a distance watching these things. The Spirit of God has been present in the reading and hearing of these words.
Thanks be to God. So we handle an awful lot on one day of the year. There's different viewpoints on this. Should we just focus on the hosannas today? And, well, if folks come through Holy Week, fine. If not, well, we let them skip straight to Easter. And you obviously can tell I'm a pastor that doesn't like to skip straight to Easter. There will be a lot that happens this week, and I commend to your own devotional reading the section of Luke's gospel that deals and addresses and shares about this last week of Jesus' life before he was betrayed. Today, though, I'm going to stick with parades. Well, at least for a little while, because they're a lot more fun to talk about. It was a great parade this morning. Thank you, parents, for sharing your children. Thanks to the children for their singing and everybody who's working with the kids to get them to sound so wonderful. Parades bring to mind fun, don't they? Maybe you remember some of parades even from your own childhood or maybe as an adult. I remember holiday parades growing up in my own town, and I have to tell you, one of the first liberation moments for me, and I think this community, as we went through that 1.5-year time period where we were a little more restrictive on how we interacted with one another, was the Halloween parade last fall. The energy was amazing, and you can tell folks were having a really great time. Probably the most memorable parade for me, besides that moment of liberation last October, was the light parade at Disney World. Now, I'm just old enough when that was emergent technology. Feeling old today. All the lights going down the block, and I can remember the wonder and awe and the need to just get in the right place. Our scriptures describe this as a parade, or more usually we interpret it as a parade. But I have to wonder, as I sat with the text this week, I have to wonder if what we were actually witness to in our gospel reading was a march for justice, a march that sent the message, don't be without hope. You see, the participants weren't there to be entertained. They were longing for a new way of life. They had been following Jesus. They had seen the healings he had worked and the other miracles he had done. And in that work and in those things, they saw with Jesus a possibility of a new life. A life where the vulnerabilities of life didn't have the final word. A life where the fears of life didn't control every thought and every emotion. A life where the deepest longings of their heart to live as whole people weren't silenced by the systems around them. The voice, aching with longing, had been held silent within for too long. I don't know about you, if you've ever tried to keep just a little confidence, like maybe a little bit of really good news that someone tells you because they're your friend, but they say, don't tell anyone, I need about a week to tell the people. Grandparents in the room might know this, what I'm talking about. Held that piece of news and how difficult it is. Imagine living a life where all of society sees you as something lesser, where not even just secular society, but religious society sees you as unwelcome and unloved. These were the people who were at that parade that day. These are the people who met Jesus as he came down from the Mount of Olives and who said, we will follow you wherever you go. In Luke, it's cloaks. There's no palms in Luke. No hosannas in Luke. In fact, when I wrote the prayer for this week, I should have looked at Luke a little closer because I have us moving from hosannas. And in fact, Luke has us moving from blessed is instead. These are the folks who were gathered, folks aching. So when Jesus responds to the others in the crowd who told him, hey, shh, we don't talk about those things. A modern movie comes to mind. I will not say the name so we don't get earworms going. We don't talk, just be quiet. The longings of the human heart for love and justice, Jesus responds to them, cannot be silenced. That's the good news in this text today. The work of love that God is doing in the world will not be held captive to any fears we might have, to any systems we might try to set up. Yes, it may take time, but it will not be held captive. Justice will roll down. If you tell these folks to be quiet, even the stones will cry out. Stephanie Shockley wrote this: in the Holy Land, if you've ever been there, you'll know what I'm talking about. In the Holy Land, stones are everywhere. In her words, seriously, about everywhere all the time. So stones would have been as common as dirt. And when Jesus is saying, if you tell them to be quiet, if they listen and they get quiet, even the stones will cry out. She says, this seems to speak to either the whole creation will proclaim Jesus, or it'll testify to the omnipresence of the Holy Spirit in our midst. Lori Blanc-Sponagel wrote a poem to speak about how the stones might speak if they had to speak or could speak. Those stones of everyday life around us, the ones that are presumed not to have a voice, she writes. If stones could speak, they might have something to say about not being noticed or called upon to witness, except when all else is silent. If stones could speak, they might have something to say, inviting us to take note of foreshadowing evident in this moment, but hinted at in the heralded birth and proclaimed in the great ushering and death and something more. If stones could speak, they might have something to say, echoing the voice of the multitude, not just here in Jerusalem on a hill blessing a king full grown, but on another hill taking up the blessing of angels, heralding a birth with peace and glory in the highest. If stones could speak, they might have something to say about the power of God that will not be thwarted or silenced even in discomfort, and the love of God that will not be defeated by violence or hate. If stones could speak, or perhaps if we would listen deep in our hearts, we would hear the stones shout about the now and the not yet, foreshadowing what will be the great stone that will be moved to reveal resurrection mystery. When Jesus and those who followed him were making such a racket at a, non-permitted event, those for whom the hope he offered, that hope which seemed too much for them, said, "Be silent." And Jesus said, "No, you will not thwart God, for creation will testify to what is going on here." I had to think about my life and of things in my life, and I mentioned the praise at the beginning, and it occurred to me, I also went to the Washington Nationals World Series parade. That was fun. But I've gone to other events that were more akin to what was happening on Palm Sunday, and some of you may as well. There was the March on Washington for Women in 2017. The night before, Ann and I were in Washington, so it was the day of the inauguration. And we witnessed a non-permitted march. I don't know if you've ever been in our nation's capital on Inauguration Day or when something big is going on, but on this particular day, there were National Guardsmen on virtually every corner. It just so happened that our hotel was on the corner where the National Guard from Pennsylvania was, so I was really happy to catch up with folks. But they were there, and the parade for the president who had just come into the presidency was just a couple blocks away behind very high fences. All you could see was the lights. When we went out to dinner, we heard drums and we heard singing. And we heard shouts, and we saw folks coming up the street with signs. It was the first time in my life I'd ever been exposed to a Black Lives Matter parade. Parade? No, march. And I thought, wow, I have a better understanding of what those who were afraid on that day when the crowd got noisy in Jerusalem might feel like. Because there's all kinds of feelings when you're all of a sudden feeling a little off balance. This can happen this week. The things of this week, the story we hear this week can knock us off balance. It offers us the challenge to keep hope alive within us as we confront the truth of our own ability to become part of the crowd who betray, who deny, who reject the cornerstone, who try to silence a word of hope and love instead of embracing it. That's this week. That's what it offers us. To hear the cry for justice coming from the stones or from others around us. And not be moved to fear, but instead to hear the truth of God's love, that God's work for justice will not ever be undone. Nothing we can do that. This week, we'll have opportunities to engage in the reflection that I'm talking about that Holy Week is meant to bring to us. For instance, this afternoon at 1 o'clock, just outside the front doors and up the block, about a block, the annual Delaware Interfaith Peace Walk will take place. It's sponsored by the Delaware Sikh Coalition, and it runs from just up the block down to Newark United Church of Christ. So if you're available, you can park here and gather there and join that walk for peace. On Thursday, as you heard announced, we will have a light supper. And still looking for 3 crock pots of soup. 10 times fast, go ahead. And on Friday evening, we'll have a wonderful opportunity to hear a cantata here sung by our chancel choir and by Ebenezer United Methodist Church. I got a taste of it and hear a taste of it the other night as they rehearsed. 7 p.m. Friday. Friends, this week, as we throw our cloaks today and we say, yes, we'll follow you, as we wave our palms, may we not become silent in confronting the needs of our neighbors. May we not become silent in our praise for a God whose work cannot be thwarted. The good news of this week is that while we seek to continue to be people of voice and action, we do so as a resurrected people, a post-resurrection people, a people who live to celebrate another stone, a stone rolled away. May it be so. Amen.